there is a real difference between change because you're moving away from something versus change because you're moving towards something. And if I look back at my career and my life, being completely transparent, I would say for the first third of it, it was about moving away from stuff. It was about proving something to myself or proving something to other people and being like, right, okay, I want to get to a certain place. And it's a way of motivating yourself, but it doesn't come from a place of going, I want to attain my highest and best.
Have you ever felt caught between competing identities in your professional life? Perhaps you've built a career on expertise and achievement in one domain only to find yourself navigating an entirely new landscape that fundamentally changes how you're perceived. Today's conversation explores the importance of evolving your identity as your context changes and how as we get older we can get more nuanced in how we relate to the complexity that change brings. We also get into how storytelling can create lasting change and the value of mentorship, the challenge of integrating professional and personal identities, and how shifting from running away from something to moving towards something transforms our relationship with work and leadership. Whether you're wrestling with complexity in your organisation or seeking to honour all dimensions of your life, this conversation offers both wisdom and a refreshingly honest take on what it means to lead with authenticity. My guest today is Hazel Maclaurin. Like most interesting and fascinating people, it's hard to put Hazel in a box, so I'll just share a few things about the hats that she's worn during her time, and these are just some of the hats. She's been a singer-songwriter, musician. She's been a poet. She's been a digital marketing specialist and a strategic HR content strategist, and she's also a committed mother. She's got a master's degree in English and has had a stellar corporate career working for a plethora of organisations in senior leadership roles, including Korn Ferry as their global content manager for enterprise and thought leadership. Hazel's professional role right now is as a self-employed strategic HR content expert, and we'll get into what that means. I suspect the essence of this, though, comes from her love of language and ability to craft words that have impact. And as testament to this, her works won more than 20 awards. She's a passionate and deeply interesting human, and I'm so pleased we're talking today. Hazel, welcome to the show.
Oh, Digby, thank you for that welcome. Thank you for having me. It's amazing to be here.
We've met in person once.
Yep.
Or kind of where you are now. Tell us, where are you right now?
I am in London, UK, Southeast London. I have behind me a picture of the Scottish Highlands. That's my husband's happy place. Not London. He reminds me all the time.
You couldn't find two more different places than London and the Scottish Highlands. That's really interesting. What does that picture mean to you, not your husband? What's that about for you?
Well, it's a calendar, so it changes every month. So two things. There's two practical things it means to me. One is just, being a calendar. Second, it's above our radiator in the house, so we can tell when the heating's on, but whether the pages move. The more meaningful one is like a lot of people, I have a little bit of Scottish heritage. And I know you and I were talking before the show, and you do too. My husband, both his parents are from Scotland and moved to England just before having him, and he's the youngest of three. And this reminds me of how important his heritage is to him. And it makes me really want to honour that link, not just because of, because he's my husband and I want to support him in that, but also because as you mentioned, I'm a mum, I have two daughters, and I want to honour that for them as well. I think it's a really nice reminder, actually. Weirdly, I grew up in Southeast London. I actually now live on a street that my own mother lived on when she was 11 wow. It was not intentional at all. So there's been 5 generations of women living on my street from my family, but we also have this connection to, as you say, an incredibly different part of the United Kingdom.
I love that. Being an Australian living in New Zealand, there's this sort of, oh, wow, I can have different places that shape me.
Yeah.
And I'm also hearing in just what you just described, you're honouring your heritage by staying in the same space for 5 generations. That's amazing.
Yeah. It's like I said, it was not intentional. We ended up moving here about 18 months ago, but it is what it is, right?
Yeah, the universe will do what it does.
It does, yeah.
Absolutely. Before we jumped into press record, we were talking about a little bit like, well, what do we want to talk about? And one of the things that I thought we could kind of move into early is the value of mentoring. And as I was doing research for the conversation, there was something you have on your website around how you've been mentored. Tell us a little bit about that experience and who that person was and how that came to be. I'm super curious about the value of mentoring from what your perspective is.
Well, let's take it a step back. I mean, we're all learning all the time, right? Like, learning doesn't stop at school or if you get a qualification or you go and learn on the job, right? And in fact, if you're hired into an organization, they expect you to be learning as you kind of continue in your career. Like if you're not continuing to learn, there's maybe a little bit of an issue there. And I think what mentoring has done for me personally, and I would hazard a guess that many people could relate to this, is it's just the value of having other perspectives, other more experienced perspectives to bring to bear on the issues that you yourself are struggling with, which might be unfamiliar to you. So the particular mentor that I name check on my website is I had the incredible privilege of being mentored and coached by Robert Saffian, who was, I believe, a managing editor at Fortune, and then he went and became editor-in-chief at Fast Company for 10 years between 2007 and 2017. And then when he left, he started a collective called the Flux Group, and he's brought in all these incredible people from his years of, interviewing CEOs and all the people that maybe, a few years ago would have been universally lauded, and maybe now it's slightly more complex. Like, so
that's diplomatic of you.
Is it? Well, like one of Bob's first great kind of moves, if you like, was he was the first person to put Mark Zuckerberg on a cover of a magazine, like a business magazine, and so that kind of stuff. So that was an incredible privilege. It happened at like an incredibly sensitive and vulnerable time for me as well, because I first met Bob when I went into an organization called Project Management Institute. I'd just been brought in because they were doing a big digital transformation and my specialism is digital content. He was asked to come in and just, give his views on some things. Like, obviously, he's seen a lot of transformations. He's seen a lot of incredible organizations and he's seen a lot of incredible leadership and has got a really interesting bird's eye view on how digital and how different leadership styles and things can bring certain goals into fruition, right? But it was a sensitive time for me because I had deliberately gone to that organization because I wanted to get to a certain place in my career. I then got the opportunity to get to that place. I wanted to be a head of content. I found out 5 days after I was off the role that I was expecting expecting a baby. And so I was suddenly like, oh my God, all my professional dreams are coming to fruition. But shit.
The universe does interesting things.
Right? I know. It's so annoying. I was finally eligible on my company's policies to travel business class and I couldn't drink the champagne. Obviously that wasn't my biggest concern, but it was a bit annoying.
I'm curious about, what did Bob see in you for him to say yes to mentoring you?
I mean, the first thing I will say, for which I'm not trying to sidestep your question, but Bob is a very generous man, and I wasn't the only person he mentored in that organization. He mentored others as well. But what I would like to think he saw in me was someone who was equally as passionate about storytelling and the power of storytelling, and the power of storytelling to change to evoke change, I would like to think that that is what he saw. He gave me some really constructive and tough feedback over the course of it. I had this whole idea about how we should have an enterprise-wide content strategy. We should know what was going on, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things he said to me is, it's appropriate. That idea, Hazel, is appropriate and is valid, and it is completely unrealistic. And I was like, that was really refreshing. Like, it was a bit complex, but I'm like, this is someone who I really respect, and not just because of everything that he's done in his career, but also because at this point we have a bit of a mentor-mentee relationship now. But like, if he's saying that, it's like, okay, he's saying that for a really good reason. He's walked a similar path. I ended up leading a team of 4 managers, and we had something like 30 headcount kind of below them, and we had a lot of open roles to fill. And I was consolidating a team in Philadelphia, but also setting up an office in London. And it was just absolutely invaluable to have a mentor to be able to go, do you know what? I'm doing all this stuff, and suddenly everything's got a bit lonelier because I've had this promotion that there are just fewer, like, plus I'm pregnant, plus, all of this kind of, and actually just to be able to speak to someone who has trodden that path, who has dealt with many of the same issues, and who's like at the other end of it, and just to be able to say, do you know what? It's going to be okay. Or even just by them being there, it demonstrates that it can be okay, right? Because they have walked the path already.
They've come through the other side of something similar, and there's lessons to learn, which makes me curious about, so that was a while ago. What lessons reverberate now, still today, that you live by?
One thing that he taught me that definitely still resonates is distinguishing between what is signal and what is noise. So the organization I worked for had a very rich heritage in project management, as you would assume it would. And the structure was maybe a little bit unusual. So it meant that you would often have experts in the organization, but it would be like 1 or 2. And then there would be these projects, and you would be expected to lend your expertise to every single one. I'm going to talk as well about another kind of like unwitting mentor, actually, who is another leader in the organization that I really, really admired. And the thing that Bob used to say to me, and the thing that this leader used to do, is just be very, very picky about like the meetings that you go to, and you don't have to accept every invitation, and understand what is adding value and what isn't, and understand where you can add value and where you can't. And I think this is a really great thing, like any leader should be thinking about, is where are the opportunities for me to take a step back so that members of my team can shine and deliver what they do, right?
I love that.
Well, I mean, I think any leader, I would hope, like the people I had around me, I was so smart. Like the person who covered me when I was on maternity leave is like a video and podcast expert. And I'm a broad spectrum content strategist, but I don't have detailed expertise in those areas. Like, and anything to that, I'd be like, yeah, you need to talk to Dan. He's the expert, not me.
It speaks a lot to ego, or the dialing down of it, and this idea of hero or host, what's driving you, and to host the space for someone else to shine. What I hear in you is that's one of your drivers. And I love this question about where you can add value and where you can't, because it speaks to me to 2 things. One is that, well, you got to know what your superpowers are.
Yeah.
The other one is not just where you add value, but where you want to add value. Because there's something about the motivation here, right? And I want to link that to what you said earlier about, and you were passionate when you said it, your passion about the power of storytelling to evoke change, right? So there's this Hazel that's like, this is what I'm about. But I suspect that wasn't always the case, when you were a little kid, right? So where does that come from? What's that about?
In order to excavate my way to the answer, because I don't have it top of mind, right? But I do want to get there.
Let's dig. We're digging deeper.
Let's dig deeper, right? So I love how you've just put that back to me, like that storytelling for power to change. Because actually, if I look back at all of the different things that I have done, so like for musician, I was a singer-songwriter, I released a single, and I was very involved in that world for a long time. My motivation there was to connect with people and evoke change. And actually, I've met a lot of musicians, and I think that is a similar motivation. I've met a lot of journalists, and that's their motivation as well. It's people who are passionate about something changing, and they're like, what tools do I have at my disposal? And it's like, using stories and art of whatever kind of ilk to connect with people. So where does that come from? Well, I don't know, Digby. I'm kind of almost going to reflect that back to you, which I'm sorry is for not really in the spirit of the podcast. But I just, I kind of wonder, like, do you have like a pivotal moment where you're like, boom, this is it? Or is it more accumulation?
So there's a couple of ways we can go, right? So what you got me thinking is, I think most leaders, most effective and really good leaders, have that inner drive to create change. Because I think, in some ways that might be the difference between leadership and management, from a what hat are you wearing? Managing is sort of like just keeping things moving along efficiently so you can be effective on something. But the leadership is going into the unknown and creating something new, right? And the leading bit is mobilizing others. The word you used was connecting with others. A lot of my work is about, what are you standing for? Asking that question. And to know the genesis of that, it can be really helpful to a point. I think you don't want to analyze it to death, but there's something about how do you put language around that has meaning, which comes from the past. We started our conversation with, honoring your heritage.
Yeah.
And there's something about honoring the lessons. So for me, one of the genesis stories, and this might be buying you some time, one of the genesis stories for me was when I was in my early 30s. I was the national manager for a recruitment company here in New Zealand. So I've lived here twice, and that was the first time. I was in over my head. I had no idea what I was doing. I was very good at recruiting and sales, but I had no idea how to lead teams and run a P&L and all that stuff. And I burned out. I'd also been thinking, I know this is the career for me long term.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I burned out really big time because I was just so stretched, so thin, and saying yes to everything, not knowing where I could add the best value, not really knowing who I was. And it led me to quite a big period of time off where I was reflecting, what? I'm much more interested in not the transactional part of plonking people into jobs.
Yeah.
But the conversations about the longer-term development of potential, both for the individuals but also for the organisational environment in which those individuals are in. So,
I love that. So you're connecting the individual plus to the organisation.
Yeah. And that comes from my dad is a businessman. My mum is very empathetic and spiritual, and those two things just perfectly married. I can tell that story easily, and this is the link to storytelling, because I've done that reflection and sense making, and it was a horrible time in my life, but the sense making I did during and after that period, there was this, this is much more who I am, and this is how I can add value, and I'm still doing it 25 years later. There's been various guises of it.
Yeah.
But there's a red thread all the way through, which comes from that realization back then. So it's sort of honoring where that comes from my parents, but also really going, this is just what lights me up.
Yes.
Yeah. And I noticed that in your language, there's this passion for the power of storytelling to create change. Man, just to kind of be able to go, and it started here.
I don't think I can point to necessarily a single moment, but I think I've always had this sense, even from quite a young age, like I was like the typical book nerd, the typical exactly who you think does 2 English degrees, just Louis books and stuff. And I think for me, there was a realization quite early on that people were using words to elicit change. And there was a realization that, like, it's not just words, but it's also knowledge transfer. Like, writing is a conduit between minds, right?
Yes.
And so that is a way of changing your perspectives and evoking change, right? I don't know if you've seen the Netflix series. It's called Three Body Problem, and it's based on the novels of a Chinese author. So, headline, spoiler alert, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's basically about an alien invasion. And one of the things that prompts one of the protagonists to invite the aliens to invade is that she has been through the Chinese Cultural Revolution. She's seen her parents be destroyed by this. And she also is given, when she's kind of put away to some labor camps, she is surreptitiously given a copy of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which was the text in the 70s that identified how pesticides were building up in the food chain and how that was causing huge issues with nature and it was poisoning far more than the pests that it was meant to control, right? And I think that's a very powerful story within a story. It was literally like she reads that and she realizes that she kind of goes, oh, using pesticides, that to me seems really neutral as an act, but actually it has this huge impact.
Uh-huh.
And that very much chimes with what she has experienced, seeing her parents being destroyed by what is happening around her in her life. That's a more recent example. But I think if you have grown up or spent a long time with books and love books, and stories and all those things, that's what a lot of stories are about, right? They're about change, whether it's a character that goes through something and changes, or whether it's a character trying to enact change on the world.
The hero's journey, right?
Right, quite literally, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in any or most popular stories, some version of the hero's journey, the beginning, the transformation, and then the returns and stuff. And, your love of language is really clear just in the way you seem to think about what I want to say. What's the word, right? And as before we press record, you mentioned the idea of nuance.
Yeah.
And the importance of nuance, particularly in the world we see today, where nuance seems to be lacking in so many quarters. Tell us about nuance and why it matters.
Well, I just want to go back to your first question actually on that, because I think this is something that I've really gained from having mentors, not just Bob Safian, but I've been very fortunate to bring in other mentors in life. And actually, when I was very serious about pursuing my music career, that was actually some career advice that was given to me. It's find mentors, find others who've trodden the path, because they help you give that nuance. They literally bring in other perspectives. I think human beings, we're all really complicated, right? We are a bunch of different motivations. And a lot of the time we don't even know what they are, right? I've just really struggled to answer that question. And I think I'm probably going to go away and think about it. And I'll be like, actually, it was a certain thing that happened when I was 8 years old. And I was like, boom, this is what, and I'll probably write you an email and come back to you on that. But we don't always know, right, what it is that shapes or drives us. And I think that particularly, certainly something that I've experienced in my career has been examples of where maybe my drivers have not come from such a positive place. They've been more about moving away from something than moving towards something.
Do you want to give us an example of that?
So, for example, I've worn a lot of different hats. And actually, there's a few more that I'm going to throw in the ring because we didn't talk about them. I've been a salesperson. I've sold everything from medical insurance to pianos. I'm a failed academic. That's why I did my master's degree. I originally wanted to be a university lecturer. And then I realized I'm not self-funding myself through a doctorate. That's just not going to happen. I've worked in marketing, I've worked in music, I've been a poet who's gone into schools. I've spent 1 week sitting at the end of a cupboard that someone had made into like a magical mystery thing, and then reading stories to the children I know, right? So it's been a very, very squiggly career. And I've also worked in global marketing teams. I've worked on $500 million acquisitions, and I've been in charge of big budgets and big teams and done, global content strategies. So very squiggly career.
Just a quick side note. Have you read the book Range by David Epstein?
Oh, no, I haven't, but someone put that in front of me this week.
Good timing.
So I feel like this is a little sign from the universe saying, read that.
Yeah. So for anyone who hasn't heard of this book, it's essentially, the subtitle is Why Generalists Will Triumph in a Specialized World. And the idea that you want to get as much of range as possible. And this is advice I give to my kids, particularly in the first half of your life. I think all of your life, to be honest, but go and range widely, because your brain wiring evolves in a different way than if you deeply specialize in one thing. And I think you can join more dots and adapt to new situations more quickly, because you've seen and have had to adapt to new situations. And I think it's a superpower. Actually, at dinner last night with some friends, we were saying about the importance of developing adaptive capacity. It's a bit of a highfalutin term, right?
Oh, I love that. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, which to me, your career, the way you've just added on another 20 bullet points to what you've done, there's something about that, your ability. I can imagine talking in even a year's time, Hazel, and okay, what's another hat you've got now, right? But I also suspect it helps you be unique. Coming back to how do I uniquely add value?
Yeah,
there's something really just that range. I just wanted to mark that, because lots of us have squiggly careers. Yours is really.
Mine is
yeah, hyper squiggly.
It's like a pinball machine.
Anyway, you were going with that, and then I said sidebar range.
We were going with that. We were going with nuance, and then we were going with what does it mean to move away from something versus move towards something.
Mm-hmm.
So an example of that I can give is actually when I was in the job I had before I had my first child, where I was a head of content, global head of content, had a really big remit. And if I am truly honest, that was about being I have to get to a certain level. I really know my stuff. It's my digital marketing and content career were the things that I did as my day job when I was a musician. So I had actually genuinely been doing it for a really long time. And I was I can add loads of value here, and I feel like I'm an expert here. And obviously what happened as soon as I got into a bigger role was I was oh my God, what got me here will not get me further. And I have to eat some serious humble pie and do a lot of learning here right now. But also I'm expected to be this leader that's supposed to have all the answers. And there's a lot of people looking to me to help them navigate. Really it was kind of a scary world. The scary is the word I'm going to use, because there was so much change.
What was scary? And what was that fear about?
I think if I look at fear in general, for the people, I think it was no one was aligned. There was a big vision, but there was no ladder connecting what you did on the day-to-day up to that vision. We just kind of sounded almost like fantasy is kind of what I'm going to say, which is a bit harsh, but it wasn't clear how you were going to get from here to there. And I think a lot of us who've worked in the corporate world, we can be familiar with the idea of organizational transformations. And to use your phrase, adaptive capacity, if people in general have that ability to be agile, that's another way we would put it, to adapt into, particularly at the moment, the world we are in, it does not stay still. And I know we all say that, but really, we're recording this on March the 1st, and there's been some very, very big, potentially very significant changes in the fabric of geopolitics in the last 24 hours. So contrasting that, what was scary about that time was we didn't know there was a vision, but we didn't know how we were going to get there, and therefore it fell out of reach. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I want to bring it back to the idea of nuance, that there's something about the black and whitedness of even, and I'm coming back to the words of your mentor saying that's completely unrealistic. I'm thinking about alignment, right? And everyone having this direct line to the vision and all that sort of stuff. I think that is kind of unrealistic too.
Agreed.
If you overcomplicate it. But there can be some shades of grey where you can go, oh yeah, no, I've got enough of that. Plus I enjoy the people I work with, and actually that's really good. And I feel like I've done really helpful work, right? And so that can't be all bad. But that's maybe an example of nuance. But you said to me that nuance is important. And this idea of being a grown-up.
Yes.
What's that about? Like, why? Why do we need nuance?
So as I mentioned earlier, like I have young children, and one of them in particular is incredibly black and white in her thinking. I like to say she's a 93-year-old in a 3-year-old's body. And that's no disrespect for 93-year-olds, but like she literally has, if I can swear, she has 0 fucks to give. She does not care. She just, she knows what she wants, and she doesn't care about like what the rest of you want. It's just like her way or the highway, and her view is very absolute. And she's also very sweet and loving and caring, and actually a very easy personality, right? I think that one of the really major differences that I see in how I approach things as I get older is just trying to really have that balance, that different nuance, and kind of understanding, not just understanding, but that almost like embracing that situations are complex and that things are not black and white. Like when you're a kid, here's an example, like many parents the world over, I've become far more familiar than I would like to with children's programming and cartoons. And once at a certain age, there is no nuances, goodies and baddies, right? It's very clear lines. And I look at the world that we live in at the moment and the politics that people are navigating and the environment that we're in. And, I'm in the UK, so we've been through Brexit, and we're still sense making that. We're still finding out what that means, right? And it's nearly 10 years ago that the vote happened. It's so much easier to go to the black and white and be like, so one thing I read the other day, a friend posted somewhere, was now it seems to be that previously it was like if we disagreed, it'd be like, I'm right and you're wrong. Now it's like, I'm right and you're evil.
Yes.
There's just no tolerance. But we're all individuals. We will all have individual experiences, and those will shape our individual perspectives. So I think nuance for me is about like understanding the truth of that, and understanding that for kind of not even just a better world, like a functional world, it would be helpful to understand that nuance is an inherent part of that, and there are different opinions. And that's kind of what I mean about it, like being a grown-up, like just understanding that that's a reality.
Let's link that to language, right? Because you can have blunt language or you can have nuanced language. How does language help us attain more nuance?
Oh, I love that. That's a great question, and not where I was expecting us to go. But I think particularly because we are recording this on March the 1st, and we've just seen some very unnuanced language. So, like probably a lot of people, I've been watching and rewatching the point in the interview in the Oval Office between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance kind of gets involved, where it all falls apart. And I would say how Vance comes across, and something he does quite a lot, he adds in, can I just add one thing? President Trump is trying to do diplomacy. He's trying to do it like this, he's trying to like that. And he very much paints a picture of, he immediately damns the previous administration outright. He immediately puts them into that baddie bucket. And then he's like, and look, here's your hero. And he's trying to do it like this without more bloodshed. And that's, humans, we like simple stories. Let's go back to storytelling. We like simple stories that we can wrap our head around. And actually, we all grew up as, when we were children, it was easier for us to think of goodies and baddies. So we can all grab onto that. So it's like, okay. And then what Zelensky does, And I just think the man's composure was incredible, considering as well, this is not his first language. He is literally embattled. I mean, talk about leadership and like, the toughest situation any leader could find themselves in. I can't remember his exact words, but he says something like, "Can I ask you a question?" to Vance. And he's like, "So," and then he tells this story, and he tells the story of,
Yes.
in 2014, they came, they annexed Australia, our people were dying, and they did this, they did that, they did that. In 2019, a ceasefire was agreed, and we were told not to give up, not to fight back for any of our land. And Merkel and Macron and all these people said, well, he signed it now. He's not going to do anything else. He'll be happy with what he's already annexed. 2022, and here he is. So I actually think it's really incredible. He asks a question. He then tells a story that is evidence-based. And then he says, he doesn't say you're wrong. He says he takes them on this journey. And then he asks, like, so what makes you think that if he agrees a ceasefire with you, it will be different? And also brings in, how are you going to feel?
Yeah, and he invites a conversation rather than a debate, and an exploration he's looking for. There's this lovely saying, seek to be accurate rather than to be right.
Oh,
and I think through that storytelling, there's the accuracy that can only come from storytelling to say, here's a more nuanced perspective around what's happening. And it's probably more accurate as a result of that, because it's not the black and white, oh no, trust us and you're wrong. This idea of nuance, I think there's something about, also what came up in my mind was that we need to be willing to slow down and explore different angles rather than, right, we've got to rush through this, make this decision in a half an hour meeting or whatever it is. So what are the basic things we need to decide on, that kind of thing. And in a rushed, hurried world, that slowing down is seen often as a luxury. And I think your mission to get storytelling, the power of storytelling as a way to create lasting change, I've put in lasting because that's what it feels like it is.
Yeah.
That requires a very different willingness to hold a space for, well, let's hear the different perspectives and let's tell stories.
Yeah.
And, are we losing that art? At dinner last night, we were talking about, there is a bit of a collapse of the world order starting to happen. Perhaps what's replacing it is grassroots initiatives that can include telling different stories.
Yeah.
And I suspect your work is really, really important in this space.
Thank you. And so that feels like a really good place to go on to another aspect of my work. But actually, I'm going to reflect it back to you for a moment, because I think this is bringing up what you talk about with being a leader who's a host rather than a hero, and creating that space for different stories. Because I think you're right. There's something, and I've been following some of your work on hurried productivity.
Mm-hmm.
So in my work as an HR content strategist, which is really a fancy way of saying I write stuff for HR audiences, the power of words, right? It's interesting because I have some clients who have even fed back to me, they're like, oh my God, sometimes we need to make a decision. We make it in a rush. We don't take enough time to reflect. And actually what happens is then we get more information, often from other people's perspectives. And then actually we have to go back and change it, because we realize what we originally did, or the decision we originally made, wasn't going to get us the outcome we wanted, because it didn't accurately reflect the needs of the people whose problem we were trying to solve.
There's also something about making a humble decision. I've just coined that phrase, but a humble decision is one where you acknowledge you don't have the complete information. And so making a decision will likely not be final. It's a for now call.
Yes.
And we will keep evolving. I'm reminded of when I had the conversation with Sir Ashley Bloomfield, and he was on the podcast and he was talking about the need to make decisions, but being very transparent. And I would say they were humble decisions during COVID. I suspect there'd be members of the public would disagree with that idea, but we've got this information. It's the best we've got right now. We're making this call based on that information, rather than we are right and this is what has to happen.
Yes.
Yeah, there's an arrogance to that. And it's, how do you have a humble decision?
And contrast that with our leader in the UK at the time.
Yeah, talk about lack of nuance. But you were just about to jump into another aspect of your work. And I'm wondering whether that's about the work around women's potential and women's place in the workforce. Tell us about that, because that's core to who you are. It hasn't really come up so far in our conversation. I'd love to explore that. Oh, well, we've been ranging widely.
We have been ranging widely, exactly. I can't wait to forget this book now. So this women's work is, I hesitate to call it a passion project of mine, because actually I feel like it's more the kind of the intersection of a lot of different parts of who I am and what I want to leave in the world, right? I think a lot of us most people, we want to leave the world a better place, right, than what we found it, okay? And I think that also speaks to the thing about like creating lasting change that we were talking about. I have been, for the last 10 plus years, somewhat steeped in sort of what I call like the corporate world, the language of money, right?
Right.
Did another podcast with Gillian Brooks, whose work I rate so, so highly. And just to be transparent, she's a friend of mine as well as your life partner. One of the things that she was talking about in that podcast, she was like, right, a really key moment for her was working out how can she help move our emphasis through, her work as an HR expert and leader from people and planet serving the economy to the economy serving people and planet. And I know that's something Kate Rayworth, the economist, is on. And
yes.
Yeah, that absolutely speaks to me too. The thing that I found, so a really big catalyst was when I became a mother. I had this very senior role, global organization, global responsibility. I was very visible. The thing I actually remember saying to Gillian was I had high visibility, high responsibility, and almost zero authority to get anything done. And that was really, really hard. The other thing that happened to me, that once I found that I was pregnant and became a mother, was for the first time I really realized how hard it is to be a working mother. And that sounds so obvious now I think about it. And it's not as if there aren't other barriers that women face. And I don't want to talk like, oh, poor women, we have this really hard deal, because I think, and you and I were talking before, like there's so many different groups, including men, including people who we might think are in the prime position according to like the structures we have in our society, who are like the winners. No, patriarchy doesn't work for anyone. And I know that's something that you and Gillian explored as well.
Yes.
But my lived experience is as a woman who has been through lots of different career iterations and been very senior and also been a mother. So that's kind of the area I feel like I have the most permission to play. And I can really empathize with so many people because I have been in their position, right? So the thing that I wanted to do as a result of that, and I did experience some difficulties, shall we say, with thinking about like, how am I going to integrate like both my work as a mother, I'm like completely responsible for the survival of this sort of thing. Like there's so many things people don't tell you before you become a parent. Like you've got to help this entity like learn how to sleep and like learn how to eat and all, like stuff it's so automatic. Like we don't even say we take it for granted. It's just part of us, but like you have to help them learn how to do this shit, right?
Yeah. It's not just a task you tick off once and it's done.
Oh, God, absolutely. Absolutely. How do I scale that with the fact that I could be commuting to the East Coast of the US 3+ times a month? Like how do I square that? And the answer was like, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It was such a confronting experience because I was like, well, hang on a second. I've worked so hard to get to this point, and I truly believe that I am the right person to lead this department. And we spoke earlier about how maybe that was not motivated from the best place. It was more like, I know that I can do this. I almost feel like this is where I should be going. This is what I should be doing, right? how do I make all these things kind of happen? And also, I would be doing we have this thing in the UK called keeping in touch days, where you literally like spend time on your maternity leave and you talk with your colleagues and your boss and stuff. And I would be like trying to do that and also like get the baby to sleep so I could have these calls and stuff. And I was like, my God, like I literally just don't have time because so much of my time is taken up doing actually what we would consider, if we are able-bodied, independent, professional adults, just life admin.
Yes.
You know?
It's interesting. It's not just time. I think it's mental and emotional capacity as well. You know, there's a lot of real estate in your brain that's been in your mind being taken up by this thing called motherhood.
Yeah.
You call it a passion project, but it's not really. It's something more than that, I suspect. Tell us about what's the mission there.
So this women's work kind of really was born out of that frustration of, my goodness, I have been like a very senior level executive. A lot of my value was tied into what my brain did and my professional experience. And then suddenly, not only am I not being valued as much for that at work because I've now have this new identity as a mother, but also I am expected to be able to do all of this, like, for want of a better word, life admin. And in part because it's seen as women's work, and it's nothing to do with my husband. He was very, supportive of all that kind of stuff. But I think what I really want to explore and explode with this project is those myths that actually it's somehow innate to women to do that. One, but the other thing I really want to explore and expose is what we lose out of by kind of having this view of women.
And when you say we, you're not just talking about women, you're talking about society.
No, I'm talking about society. And I'm talking about what is the economic impact of excluding women from the workforce, just because traditionally they have taken a certain role, right?
Yeah. I love that explode. And it's classic change maker mindset, right? It's like, well, why does it have to be that way? You talked about your uniquely, this is the permission you've got to play in because you've got lived experience. And I suspect there's many, many, many people listening to this right now who will be just nodding their heads. And I hope it's not just women.
I hope so too. I really hope so. I hope it's men too. And I hope it's men who feel like they haven't been able to ask for a flexible working arrangement because there's been an expectation of them to show up in a certain way at their work. And I hope it's senior men who, God forbid, like regret that they couldn't spend more time with their kids when they were younger because of the expectations of work and family.
Yeah. And all of those stories that we've lived in rather than challenged or not been successful at challenging. Yeah. You strike me as someone who really has found their voice and are finding different ways to channel it. There's this content strategist piece. There's this women's work piece. There's this coming on this podcast. I guess the final question before we wrap up is around how you keep evolving. What's your process? And it might be a hard question. What's your process to keep reinventing and evolving? How do you think about that?
That's such a great question. And I'm going to answer it in a couple of ways, if you don't mind. So one is, I think for me, there's actually quite a clear demarcation of how my evolution evolved. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to come back to something I said earlier, which is there is a real difference between change because you're moving away from something versus change because you're moving towards something. And if I look back at my career and my life, being completely transparent, I would say for the first third of it, it was about moving away from stuff. It was about proving something to myself or proving something to other people and being like, right, okay, I want to get to a certain place. And it's a way of motivating yourself, but it doesn't come from a place of going, I want to attain my highest and best. That top of Maslow's pyramid of needs, I want to achieve self-actualization. It's more about, maybe I don't think too highly of myself, or I've got certain inadequacies or things I'd like to change, and I want to run away from them, right?
I think people can relate to that, yeah.
I hope it's a very human thing to me. I hope it wasn't just me.
I certainly relate to it. It's the driven by the need to be accepted or to prove to others that you're awesome or whatever it might be. Right?
Precisely.
It's the belonging piece in the hierarchy, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when we were talking previously about this, I said, you asked me, like, what is the driver for evolution? And I said, well, earlier on in my life, it was shame. It absolutely was. It was like, oh my God, right, how can I prove I'm good enough? And how can I make sure I'm accepted? And all of those things you've just said. And it was clearly such a pivotal moment for me. When I became a mother, it kind of changed because I was like, oh, suddenly I have this little person that I have to try and show that is awesome. And she's just awesome because she's here, right? She hasn't had to do anything. She's here. She's awesome. Like, that's it. And I was like, how do I try my absolute utmost to make sure that she still feels that when she's got the noise of the world encroaching?
That's beautiful.
And I did a lot of research, and I talked to a lot of people, and I've talked to therapists, and I discovered this concept of self-compassion. And I'm sure, like, many of us kind of would hear the phrase self-compassion, we might have an idea of what it is. There's actually been a lot of research done around this, like the power of self-compassion, which is to kind of treat yourself like you would treat a good friend, in a nutshell. There's been so much research about actually how effective it is in terms of not just making you feel better, but also in eliciting change. And if you look up Dr. Kristen Neff, or you look up self-compassion, like you can find all this research. It kind of stretches back 20 years when it first started to be published. It's actually an incredible driver for change. And, the bonus point, it's more effective than self-criticism, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is something, if a lot of us, if we've come from this more, let's move away from something than move towards something, we can often use criticism to help us.
It feels like self-compassion is the portal. It's the doorway from moving away from things to moving towards things. You've got to first adopt self-compassion.
Yeah, I think, well, that has been certainly for me.
I really relate to that.
That's so interesting. I'm so fascinated to hear that. That's probably a whole other podcast episode.
I'm feeling like it is. I feel like we need to deep dive on a couple of themes around this women's work and this idea of self-compassion. So perhaps we're just putting a pin in that. Let's come back to that.
Maybe let's have a repeat. Yeah.
Yes, please. All right. We've just made a commitment live here.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm sitting here pretty mind blown and heartfelt admiration and connection with you that I've, like I mentioned earlier, we've only met really, we've spent a little bit of time together, but not a lot. I'm reflecting on your capacity for self-reflection and self-knowledge. Clearly, you've had to build into, I think, claiming the life you want. And, you're very articulate. This is your power of words, right?
Yeah.
It's affecting me. And I suspect there'll be these reverberations from these conversations for me for a very long time.
Can I have that as a testimonial, please? Please hide it.
You can, absolutely. And I'm also curious about, what are you taking from this conversation? What have you learned? What have you been reminded of? What's come up for you?
What I've been reminded of, particularly when we've been talking about evolution, is actually that some things never change, and the power of acknowledging that, the power of like finding what those things are, and like what's that red thread or that golden thread that goes through your life. And some of this comes from the conversation we were having a little bit before we started recording, but it's kind of become even more sharply into focus during the conversation, which is, if I look back at all my different evolutions of what I was doing professionally, whether it was musician or a poet in schools or digital marketing for human resources consultancies, I have this absolutely like real core belief and drive to help people like reach their highest and best, do that self-actualization piece. And part of that is kind of selfish. It's for me too. I want to reach my full potential. But I love it when I kind of literally see people living their best lives. And that doesn't mean they've got it all figured out. It just means they're standing and living in their truth, and they're so aligned to who they are, and they are making that work in a world that often feels like it doesn't really value us as individuals. It's that language of money thing again. It's how productive can you be within this set of parameters? And I love it when I meet and get to work with, or, if my work can help people move further on that path.
Beautifully put. How can people find you if they want to connect with you? What's the best way for people to do that?
So this women's work, as you said, is in beta, but it is going to be like a much bigger project. You can go to my Substack, which is substack.com/thiswomenswork. You can go to the website, which is thiswomenswork.com, and you can have a look at my writing that I do for brands that serve the people profession on hazelmaclaurin.com.
Awesome. And I suspect there's also LinkedIn as well.
Oh, yes, there is LinkedIn. Yes. Come and say hi on LinkedIn. I am very much there.
And that is MAC?
MACLAURIN.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for being in conversation, being real, and sharing so much wisdom with us.
Thank you, Digby, so much for inviting me. It's been such a pleasure. And as always with our conversations, I've come away feeling really enriched, and I've learned a lot. And I know that's going to continue to reverberate for a good little while.
Likewise. Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.
Just a quick reflection before we finish up. Talk about the power of range. That conversation was probably one of the most wide-ranging podcast conversations I've had so far, from the power of mentors to the challenge of women's work, and the idea of nuance and range, and this idea of changing, is moving away from or moving towards, and the difference between that. Self-compassion, man, so much stuff in there. She strikes me as someone who is a polymath, someone who is claiming her life amidst the complexity of life and leaning into the juggle, leaning into the challenge. And she's inspiring as a result of that. I think, the more real we can be about how we are as leaders to show up, and we're doing our best and sharing the challenge, sharing the juggle, coming down from the stage where, having to be all together and saying, hey, yeah, look, I'm like you. That really came through to me. And I think that's really refreshing. Curious about, what's your takeout? What's your one thing that you might go and reflect on or share or dig into or maybe experiment with? If you're interested in digging into a few of the ideas, here are 3 episodes that might be useful that we reference. So Sir Ashley Bloomfield, episode 7, around making decisions when you don't have all the answers. And Jodie Willock's episode 10 around the idea of the squiggly career. It's a really rich conversation there. And episode 11 with Gillian Brooks about how do you make work better for everyone. Just a few more resources for you. I'll also include links in the show notes to a whole lot of ideas we talked about, as well as the transcript. And I would just ask you as well, please just share this with one other person, someone you think would get some value from this, because the more you can get into conversation about it, the more these ideas become real. I'm Digby Scott. This is Dig Deeper. And until next time, go well.